Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Jeff Probst video. Once again, running through Survivor history, but this time talking about what I think Jeff Probst's favorite moments are from every season. Which is an idea here that I think is kind of funny because, straight up, I don't think many of these moments are actually going to be real moments. Because my entire thought process of how to approach this video is essentially, if you sat Jeff down and literally asked him this question, what is your favorite moment from this season? What is his actual response? And straight up, a lot of the time, I don't think he actually mentioned specific moments. I think he just mentioned specific things about season, whether it be a storyline or something production did on the season, to where, again, I don't think many of these are real moments, but I think that's what makes this video even funnier. But again, this is how I personally think Jeff would respond to questions like this for every season of the show. With that, let's start off with Survivor Borneo, where I think this one he would actually say a genuine moment. I mean, I think there are two moments that would really stick in his mind. I think you got the Snakes and Rats speech, obviously one of the most iconic moments in Survivor history, which would obviously be on top of his mind, though I think the moment he would mention, something he has mentioned in the past as being most favorite moments in the history of the show, is the first scene of the show, the opening marooning, to where, again, obviously it's just such a special moment for Jeff, obviously the first moment of him ever being host of the show, to where he constantly talks about his memories of this scene, to where, again, I do think for Borneo in particular, I do think the opening scene is something that definitely stands out for him. So again, I think he would answer that there. Next up for Australian Outback, and straight for Australian Outback, I think this one's a bit tough. I actually think this one can go all over the place. I feel like there isn't really a definitive answer here. While there is a by far most iconic moment from this season, I'm not sure if that's how he would answer it. I mean, at the time he very much loved Colby, and I did wonder if there was a Colby related moment that Jeff would answer, though at the same time, they obviously didn't end up being on the greatest terms post Heroes vs. Villains, so again, who knows where he really stands with that now. I know he likes Tina as a winner, but I never got the sense that he loves Tina as a winner, to where that would be his favorite moment of the season. I did once again consider the opening scene of the season, where they had the players on a plane, which obviously ends up being a radically different type of intro than Borneo, but the answer I end up going with here is the most iconic moment from the season. It is Scoop and falling in the fire, and again, I'm not super solidified on this one. I feel like this one is, again, one that I don't really have a solid answer for Jeff for Australian Outback. However, I do think the moment of Scoop and falling in the fire is something that I do feel like he would bring up as something that showed that Survivor was real. And while I do think this is a moment that is probably more of a Mark Burnett moment than it is a Jeff-specific moment, I do still feel like for Jeff, he recognized how important of a moment this was. So again, I decided to go with that one here. Next up for Survivor Africa, and Africa is the first point here where I think we're getting a question mark on whether or not this is actually a real moment. So again, I think there's a couple things to mention here. I think there's a couple things revolving around Ethan, where, again, it's very well known post-show that he loves Ethan. He was very happy with Ethan as the winner of this season, where, again, I think Ethan winning, that could be a moment that he would remember. Even then, the fake out at the finale and pretending like they filmed on set could be a moment that he would remember. I think the moment of Ethan in the village is something that obviously stands out as well, though I think the moment he would mention here, again, is debatably even a moment, but that is the tribe swap. And by that, I don't even mean the actual moment of the tribe swap. I just mean the concept of this being the first season with a tribe swap. Where again, I think if you go to Jeff and ask him this question, what's your favorite moment from Africa? I think he'll go on this spiel about how, Africa was the first season, had a swap. Talk about how fundamental that was to Survivor history. And again, I feel like this is a spot where he would give a non-answer, but the answer would essentially just be the swap, with him not even talking about the actual swap moment and more so just talking about the concept of the swap. But again, at the end of the day, I think with seasons like this, I think he'll try to mention things that are relevant to the modern day, and I think obviously the first swap is something that is obviously very important here, so I think he would go with that. Next up for Survivor Marquesas, and this is another one. There's a couple answers. I mean, obviously this is a season with the fall of the Road to 4, and again, while it's a very iconic moment, I don't know if Jeff would answer that. I came very close to picking the rock draw, which obviously is a fundamental moment for Survivor history, changed tiebreak rules down the road, though I don't think he would pick that either. The thing I do think he would pick, though, and there's explicit proof for this, I think he would pick a complete non-moment, and it being the first appearance of Boston Rob. And again, it's a ridiculous thing to pick here. However, I do think he would 100% pick this. Where again, he made his season ranking at the time of Heroes vs. Villains, where in his entry for Marquesas, he hates Marquesas, he always has, but he does talk about how boring the season was, but the one good thing we got from this season was Boston Rob. Again, straight up, I think that is probably his answer here. I don't know if his opinions have warmed up since then, or maybe he would actually go for a more genuine answer. Yeah, I do think the first appearance of Boston Rob is what his pick would be here. Next for Survivor, Thailand. And really, I feel like there's only one answer here, as I think in general he tries to forget Thailand even existed. But I think it's easily the fake merge. I mean, he's even talked about it on Fire Podcast in the past, where obviously Jeff hates Thailand. I think he just tries to not remember Thailand happened. Yeah, again, he went out of his way to mention the fake merge. So, I mean, that's something. It's something he remembers. I think it'll probably be his favorite moment. So, again, there we go. Next up for the Amazon, and this one also has a pretty definitive answer. We're straight up, I don't even know if he remembers the Amazon particularly well anymore. I think, again, he remembers Rob Cesternino. I think he remembers the men versus women dynamic. However, I think there's one moment in particular he mentions quite a bit, though obviously that's stopped in the modern day, considering this is not particularly PC anymore. But obviously the answer I'm going to go with here is Jenna and Heidi stripping for chocolate and peanut butter, which, again, is a moment that hasn't aged particularly well, but it's a moment that, at least up to, I believe, around the time Survivor 30, Jeff was still hyping up this as pretty iconic moment, to where, again, he hasn't talked about it in a while, specifically because, again, it hasn't particularly aged well, but considering it's pretty much the only moment from the Amazon I feel like he's mentioned at any point post Heroes vs. Villains, I feel like this is definitely the moment I'm going to go with. Next for Pearl Islands, and Pearl Islands, again, I think there's a pretty definitive answer here, and I think pretty much goes along with what you would expect. However, I do think there's a couple of other things to mention. Obviously, the first appearance of Rupert, the first appearance of Sandra are things he could remember here. Obviously, the opening village sequence is something that was unique for the show and something I think he remembers. Also, the debacle over Burton winning immunity and him having to strip Burton of that immunity win and give it to Dara. I think that is something he very much remembers as well, as, again, he's talked about that on the On Fire podcast recently. However, I, again, feel like there's almost no way he doesn't answer Dead Grandma Lie in this instance. I feel like that's something that it was just so big for the show and was something that, again, he very clearly thought was a great moment for the show, to where, while, again, he doesn't fair play particularly well, I do feel like that is still the moment he would bring up here. I'm also talking about how much of a villain fair play is, but again, I do think that's the definitive answer here. Next up for Survivor All-Stars, and I mean, there's a pretty obvious answer here. And again, this one's debatably a moment. It's pretty much just a season-long storyline. But again, obviously, you can mention the Robin Lex deal, which I think he definitely has fresh on his mind. But I mean, the obvious answer is the Robin Amber relationship. To where, again, I think you can specify it to them making the final two and Rob proposing, though really, I think the answer is genuinely just the entire relationship, just the entire storyline on the season. As, again, I think he'll just go on this spiel about how they got together on the show, got married, had kids, went back on Survivor at Winners of War. Again, I feel like he would go on this massive spiel about their relationship as a whole, more so than talking about any specific moment outside maybe the proposal. But I think his answer would essentially just be the Robin Amber relationship. Next up for Vanuatu, and I mean, Vanuatu's in our season I think Jeff tries to forget at this point. I think it's a season that he doesn't look back on too fondly, where obviously it's a point where, and he met Julie, dated Julie for a few years, it ended, supposedly not on the greatest terms, where I think he tries to forget that aspect of it. Also, I think it being the season that came after All-Stars and not being particularly well received, something that he didn't love at the time as well, where really I feel like this is one that I don't think he remembers many moments from it. However, I will give an answer here. It's not one that I don't think you would fully expect, but that moment is essentially just Chris outplaying the women, which, again, isn't really a specific moment. It's really just, again, a storyline. And, again, it's weird to answer this, considering, obviously, Jeff hated Chris at the time. I mean, he does go on to really trash him at the reunion show, and clearly just annoyed at him at points on the season. A lot of it seemingly due to his connection to Julie Berry. But, again, the reason I'm answering this here is because we do see years later, during the Heroes vs. Villains preseason, Jeff did a season ranking, the first 19 seasons. In his entry for Vanuatu, he does specifically mention that one of the good things about this season is Chris outplaying the women, to where I think this is kind of one of these things that, again, Jeff does this all the time, of really just simplifying a player's run into just a singular line that he would just constantly repeat. And I feel like with Chris at this point, again, he remembers Chris as the guy that outplayed the women. And again, considering that's pretty much the only thing he's mentioned from Vanuatu in years, I feel like that is the answer I'm going with here. Next up for Palau, and this is one that I think there's a lot of answers, obviously. I mean, he very much liked Tom at the time. I think you could definitely talk about Tom's immunity run, or Tom going on to win the game. Obviously, he loved Stephanie at the time, and you could very much mention Stephanie being on her own and persevering through that. You could also talk about the entire desolation of Oolong. You could also talk about the first fire-making challenge, which, again, Jeff will hype up as something to correlate back to the modern show. Yeah, I feel like there's a definitive answer here, as this is a moment that Jeff constantly talks about as being one of his favorite moments, and that is the final immunity challenge. I mean, Jeff has talked a lot about how epic this immunity challenge was and how long it went for, where, again, I feel like this is one of the few moments from this season that he does still mention in the modern day, to where, again, I think that would be his answer here. Next up for Guatemala, and straight up, I don't think he remembers Guatemala much at all. I mean, Guatemala is a season that, again, Jeff never particularly liked. I don't think he necessarily hated this season. I just think he just felt nothing with the season, to where even by the time of his season ranking at the time of There's Villains, he literally didn't even bother to write a description for the season. So again, I doubt he remembers much from the season at this point. I think there's a couple things to mention, though. Again, I think the big trek at the beginning of the season is something that he could potentially remember. I think Danny winning is something that, again, at least pre-Winners at War, I could see being a potential answer, because, again, he had always been open, him liking Danny Boatwright. But I think the answer here is, again, pretty definitive. Again, kind of similar to the answers of the Tribe Swap and the Rock Draw. I think the answer here is the first ever hidden immunity idol, where obviously he has mentioned the history of the immunity idol before and talking about how it started in Guatemala, to where, and I think that's pretty much the only thing he really remembers from this season, to where, considering obviously that also radically changed the show moving forward, I feel like that is the answer he'll pick here. Next up for Panama, and again, here we're getting a complete non-answer here, as I think Panama is one of these where, again, there are answers to be had here. Again, obviously there's the 3-2-1 from Suri, there's like Terry's huge immunity run. You know, he talks about like Shane and his Blackberry, though I think the answer here is kind of a non-answer in it just being Suri and Suri's story on this season. Again, something that he constantly talks about from Panama, where, again, Panama is a season that he doesn't really talk about too often, though he obviously still loves Suri to this day. And he does obviously mention the story of her getting off the couch and playing the game. And I feel like that is the thing he would mention from Panama, which, again, isn't even a real moment, but it is really just her arc on this season that I think is the most notable aspect of this season to him, to where, again, I think he would pick that. Next up for Cook Islands, and in Cook Islands, another one that I think he'll essentially just pick a storyline over an actual moment, though I think there are moments to talk about here. Again, you have the Billy Garcia moment, which might come up. I considered Ozzy's immunity run. I considered Yule's usage of the immunity idol. I did come extremely close to picking the run of the I-24, which, again, I think modern Jeff would love the story of the I-24. I think this is the type of thing he's looking for in modern Survivor, these stories about perseverance and these underdogs coming out with the win. And I think that would be his pick if this was a recent season. Yeah, I think because the season's so far back, I don't know if the I-24 is super top of mind for him. However, something I do think would probably be a bit more is, again, something that is loosely attached to this being the first season ever with a Final 3, but I do think his official answer would probably be Yule versus Ozzy at Final Tribal, where, obviously, again, this was the first ever Final 3. It allowed for there to be this Yule versus Ozzy battle at Final Tribal, and that is something that I think he would utilize this to be this propaganda of why Final 3s are better than Final 2s. I mean, this is something that he constantly talks about in modern day, about how he still believes that that's the case, and I think this is just the full justification for that. To where, again, even at the time he said it was the best strategic player against the best physical player, and again, I think that is a dichotomy that he does like. So again, I think at the end of the day, that would be his pick here. Next for Fiji, and again, I think this is a pretty obvious one. While you can mention, obviously, this being the first season that had the first ever modern immunity idol, I think his answer here would be what he actually previously called the only interesting moment on this season, and that is the Yao Dreams car deal, which was, again, a really big moment at the time, and it was really something that they hyped the entire season around, where even in the preseason, they were really hyping up this moment, which is even more surreal because this is literally a thing that happens in the penultimate episode of the season. Yeah, I think it's very clear how highly they looked at this moment at the time. So where, again, Jeff literally says in his season ranking before Here's Villain that this was essentially the only thing good about this season, where, again, I think that'll probably be the answer. While over time, again, I don't know how much he really remembers this now. I feel like, considering, again, we have definitive proof of him at least saying that this was the answer at one point in Survivor history. That is the one I'm going to go with here. Next for Survivor China, and really, I feel like this is a pretty easy answer. I feel like Survivor China is a season that, again, while it's a very consistently good season, I feel like it is kind of lacking in like these big moments to talk about, though. I do think the potential answers are Jamie's fake idol play, which, again, is the first time a fake idol gets utilized in the game. So, again, might mention that. He might also go in this long spiel about just the concept of filming in China and how unique of an experience that was, and how Survivor became the first reality show to film in China. And again, I'm sure that would be something on his mind as well. However, I do think the answer he would go with is the James blindside. I mean, him being blindsided with 2 idols in his pockets, which again is still a moment mentioned to this day. It's still a moment that is referenced to this day, to where I do think this is probably the most iconic moment to come from this season. So again, I do think it is the one that Jeff would most remember. This is for Survivor Micronesia, and again, this one's so easy. Now, I think you can debate if he would really cheaping out on the answer here. Obviously, the Black Widow Brigade is the main thing he remembers from this season. The question is, like, will he answer that as a general concept, or will he mention the more specific moments, which, again, I will answer properly here, and that being the Eric blindside. Where obviously the Eric blindside, really iconic moment for a show, something that is constantly referenced to across Survivor history, which, again, I think this is one of Jeff's favorite moments in Survivor history. So again, I think if you really force Jeff to mention a specific moment, this is 100% the moment. However, I think there is definitely a world where Jeff just instead goes on this spiel about the Black Widow Brigade and all the moves they made, and kind of made it as this big collective, talking about the Eric move and the Ozzy move and the Jason move, and talking about how women really manipulated the men, because that's Jeff for you, to where, again, I think it could be either of those. I am leaning towards just saying the Eric blindside, though, as again, that's actually a real moment. But anyway, with that, we move on to Survivor Gabon. And I think Gabon's a weird season here. I think as time goes on, I would be pretty surprised if Jeff remembers Gabon that well, especially considering, again, how negative of experience it was for him. I mean, again, it's pretty well known that Jeff was on the fringe of quitting the show at this point. And again, I don't think he looks back on this season particularly fondly. I do know at the time that he looked at Randy as a really great villain for the show, and I think Randy's boot in particular is something you can mention here. However, I'm going to go with something Bob related, which is weird considering, again, Bob's like a pretty minor character on the season despite being the winner. Yeah, I think, again, looking back on the season now, I think Bob is the person he would remember. The question is, which Bob thing do you mention here? Do you mention Bob winning? Which, along with that, I think Jeff would talk about how, oh my god, he's the oldest guy to win Survivor, as again, that's one of the only things he really remembers for Bob. Or is he going to mention the moment I am going to mention here, and that is Bob utilizing fake idols in the game, because I think that is also a thing that he has glorified over time. The concept that Bob was able to make a fake idol and that led to him winning the game, as again, that's just Jeff for you to really oversimplify a storyline like that, to where I'm going to lean towards that. I mean, realistically, the answer is essentially something related to Bob's win, whether it be, again, just the fact that he's old, or the fact that he made a fake idol. Either one, but again, I'm going to lean towards the fake idol thing, because I think he'll use that to correlate into going on a spiel about how making fake idols are useful in the game, as that's something he just wants people to do. But with that, we move on to Survivor Token Chains, and this one's pretty close between two non-moments, essentially, and that is essentially JT and Steven and their dynamic, or it's Coach. I decided to go Coach, to where I know at the time he was very high on Coach. Again, you could definitely tell how much he loved Coach through his blogs, to where, again, he just really recognized Coach as one of the greatest characters in the history of the show. And again, I think his answer would be Coach. Now, if you want to bring up a specific moment, obviously you bring up him on Exile Island. However, again, I don't know if Jeff would even mention that moment while talking about Coach. I think he would just mention the crazy character that is Coach, more so than, again, mention a specific moment from him. Next up for Survivor Samoa, and again, there's the definitive answer here. I don't even think it's really that close. Obviously, everything is Russell related, because this is Samoa for you, but to be fair, I mean, if there is a non-Russell moment to mention, it's probably Russ Swan almost dying in a challenge. I think that's something that Jeff would talk about. Obviously, you have Russell running the game and losing at the end. That's something to mention, though. I think the moment he'll talk about here, again, a very easy answer for me, and that is Russell finding an idol without a clue. Because obviously he used to talk about how much that changed Survivor, and again, a moment that Jeff can correlate easily to the modern day, and something that he does remember pretty well. Next up for Heroes Villains, and again, there's a pretty definitive moment here as well. Yeah, I think there's other things to consider. Obviously, Sandra winning twice. That's something to talk about. I think Tyson voting himself out is also something to talk about. I think the Rob Russell dynamic is something to talk about. I think JT giving Russell an idol and writing a letter is something to talk about. Yeah, I think the actual answer here is, again, something he does talk about in the modern day still. I think it is the double idol play from Parvati. He does talk about that as like one of the best moves in the history of the show, and obviously considering his love for Parvati, him calling Parvati the best player of all time after Winners at War, I do feel like this is a moment in particular that he does remember her for, where I do think this is probably the answer for this season. Next up for Nicaragua, and straight up, I don't know how much Jeff remembers Nicaragua, especially in a positive light, as obviously I think the main thing he remembers Nicaragua for is the double quit, which again, that's not something he likes, to where, and when we're trying to look at more positive moments for Nicaragua. I think the answer I'm going to go with here is Fabio winning, which again might not be expected here, where I think some people would probably assume that Jeff doesn't like Fabio that well. Obviously, Fabio was in the running for Winners at War, and Fabio's a winner that really hasn't been mentioned much in the modern day. Yeah, at the time, he really loved Fabio. Again, if you read his blog, he was very complimentary of Fabio and was very happy that Fabio won the game, where, again, I feel like this is just a season that's kind of void of moments that Jeff himself likes. So, again, I'm just going to go with Fabio's win as his answer here, because why not, I guess. But next up, we're moving on to Redemption Island, and this is the definitive answer. Who would have guessed it? It's actually just the same thing as the previous season, but just for a person he likes even more, and obviously that's Rob winning. Where, again, I think Rob winning Redemption Island, that's his favorite moment. I think it's the fact that Rob, again, finally got his win after 4 seasons. I think that is something that Jeff will obviously talk about. Now, again, other potential considerations are, Rob winning Final Immunity. You also have, like, Matt in his story on Redemption Island. In general, the concept of Redemption Island, which, again, Jeff is still pretty high on, despite the fact that, obviously, he knows that other people aren't, to where I think those are things he would mention. I think, again, the fact that Rob wins this season is definitely a thing that he would first think of from this season. Next up for South Pacific. And South Pacific, actually, I think is a little bit of a difficult one, just because I feel like South Pacific's another season that I don't know how much this season really stuck with Jeff. I feel like this is one that you don't really hear Jeff talk that much about. Or because of that, I think I'm going to go with something that isn't, again, really a moment, though. The thing I know Jeff very much likes from this season, that is that this season gave us Cochran. Obviously, again, he loves Cochran. Obviously, his win in Karamoan might be something that we talk about, but again, this is the starting point for Cochran. This is Cochran being this nerdy figure that, again, isn't treated well on the island. And again, obviously, he later develops once he gets to Karamoan and plays a more impressive game. But again, I think if you ask Jeff about South Pacific, I think he might just go to mention that this being the starting point of Cochran and Cochran's run on this season, or while I think you could also mention like Ozzy's run this season, or again, if you want a specific moment, I think you could say Cochran flipping at the merge, but really I would not be shocked if he just in general just mentions the fact that this is Cochran's first season and the arc that he ends up going through. But with that, we move on to One World, where this one's a bit tough, actually, because I feel like One World's another one that, again, he has not looked back on particularly fondly. And I think there's a moment here that I think this would have been the moment at the time. I don't know how well this moment has aged. So while I did consider something like Kim winning, as we know that he was very high on Kim at the time. We also got, like, the men giving up immunity, going to tribal, something to mention. However, the answer I'm going to go with here, again, is a moment that I know he liked at the time, though I don't know if it stuck, but I'm going to answer it still here, and that is Troyzan's This Is My Island moment. Where, again, Jeff loved Troyzan at the time. Troyzan was like one of his favorite players. They kept on trying to bring Troyzan back, despite the fan base not seeming to be as into that idea. All again, obviously, I'm sure he was disappointed with Troyzan on Game Changers, and now, again, isn't as much of a Troyzan stan. I do feel like at the time, this would probably be the moment he would mention. Though, again, I just don't know how well this moment has aged. Where I could definitely see where we're now, he would mention, like, the men giving up immunity as his moment. But I decided to go with something that, again, I feel like there's a little bit more proof for, at least at the time the season aired. And again, because I went with the Troyzan This Is My Island moment. Next up for our Philippines, and this is one where, again, we're not going with an actual moment, but a storyline, where I think there's a couple storylines to actually mention here. Again, you do have Lisa's story, which is something, again, we know Jeff was particularly close to Lisa postseason, and I could see him answering that. Also, we got to go with the more defining storyline of the season, that is the Malcolm Denise relationship, which again I think is pretty easily his answer. I think it's definitely the biggest thing he remembers from this season is Malcolm Denise and them being these underdogs early on, then they take control of the game, and then obviously Denise cuts Malcolm at the end and wins the game. Again, I think that's what he'll remember. There's a chance that he mentions like the concept of Denise going to every tribal or Malcolm bluffing his idol, though I think at the end of the day I would presume he would just mention the general concept of Malcolm Denise and just call it a day. Next up for Karamoan, and again, we're essentially just going with the same answer again from South Pacific, but again, it's Cochran's storyline. I think that's his definitive moment from Karamoan. I think the thing he remembers Karamoan for is Cochran's win, and how much Cochran developed from his first appearance to where, and I think that's the definitive answer here. I don't even think there's really another possible answer. While, again, Three Amigos obviously is a big moment, the first, big live tribal, I feel like it's still something that is not good enough for Jeff to overtake his love of Cochran, to where, again, I do think Cochran's storyline from this season is easily the pick here. Next for Blood versus Water, and again, there's two big moments from this season to mention. There's obviously the rock draw, which is obviously big moment, first rock draw since season 4, obviously a moment that he loves, something that was very much a consideration, but the answer I'm going with here is obviously Sierra voting out her mom. And again, I think this is pretty easily the answer. I mean, this is a moment that he constantly talked about, obviously. Even going to Game Changers when Sierra was on the cast, he went out of his way to mention that she voted out her mom. But again, I think he loves this moment. He loves that this really fulfilled the themes of Blood versus Water. The point of Blood versus Water was to see how far you would go in a game that you have to play for your loved ones. I think to see someone actually vote out their loved one is something that, again, fully fulfills this season. Where, again, I think that is his answer here. I think it's something that he loved at the time, and I think it's still what he would mention now. Next up for Kage-Yan, and Kage-Yan actually I think is a pretty difficult one, as obviously you got Tony, and really there's a lot to mention from Tony. You got his bag of tricks, you got him constantly finding idols, you have his spy shack. Again, I think those are all things to mention here. However, as much as I do think Jeff likes Tony, I never got the sense that he loved Tony. To where a Tony moment would really be his answer for a list like this. And again, I'm going to go with something that I think this is the answer for the time. This is the answer for sure immediately after Kage-Yan. I don't know if this is what he would mention now, or nowadays maybe he would go back and mention spy shacks in particular, but I am going to go with what I feel like is the definitive answer at the time, and that is Spencer's storyline. And again, I think this is another one that, again, he just remembers the generality of, I hated this guy preseason. I said he had zero chance of winning this game, and he proved them wrong. And I think that's something that, again, really made him love Spencer on this season. The fact that he was just so wrong about Spencer in the preseason and would constantly talk about how wrong he was on Spencer in the preseason. To where, again, at the time of Kage-Yan, really up until Cambodia, I think this would have been the definitive answer. Or even then, he would talk about it during Cambodia, that this was still a thought that he had at the time of Kage-Yan. Where, again, I don't know how well this is aged. I do think nowadays, I think this concept of Spy Shack is probably more notable. I do think at the time this is the definitive answer, so I'll still go with it here. Next up for San Juan del Sur, and this is another one where, again, I think we're gonna get a very loose answer here. Another one that's pretty much just a storyline more than an actual individual moment, but I think his answer would essentially be Natalie getting revenge. Again, not actually an individual moment within any of that, but just the concept of her getting revenge. Where, again, I think he would go on this spiel about how she took out the people that took Jeremy out of the game and then went on to win the game. I feel like, again, that is the thing Jeff would talk about here. Again, he would not remember the nuances of what exactly happened within any of this. I very much doubt he remembers the moment of Natalie voting out Alec, or really the inner workings of the John blindside, or even the Baylor blindside. Yeah, I do feel like he remembers this general concept of Natalie getting revenge, to where I think that's the answer here. Next up are Worlds Apart, and Worlds Apart's one that, again, there's a very definitive answer at the time. I don't know if this has changed over time, especially considering how little he mentions this moment now. Yeah, at the time, I think the definitive answer is Mike winning the game. / also Mike's immunity run, but again, essentially Mike's story on this season. I think that is the answer here, as, again, at the time, he was so excited about this story that he even spoiled it in the preseason, talking about how likable and rootable this winner is going to be, to where he went out of his way because he was so excited about this storyline to essentially spoil the season. So again, I think at the time this is the definitive answer here. I do think as time goes on, and again, obviously they passed up Mike numerous times, I do think there's definitely a chance that maybe he's not as high on Mike anymore, yet really, when looking at this season, I don't know if there's many other moments I could see Jeff really loving. Maybe talk about, obviously, this being the season that introduced other advantages to the game outside of idols, is having the first ever extra vote, and again, that's maybe something to mention, but I do think the more definitive answer is just Mike's story on the season. Next up for Survivor, Cambodia, and this one, again, has numerous answers here. Again, he loves Cambodia. I think there's multiple things that he can mention. Obviously, Wentworth's idol play is something that was obviously big for the season that I think he'll definitely mention. He can also mention the creation of voting blocks, which, again, wasn't really a new thing necessarily here, but I think Jeff could definitely go out of his way to really hype it up as one. I think also the concept of having idols and challenges is something that Jeff would talk about as something that they first did on this season, though. I could also see him just going on a spiel about the high level of gameplay on the season, and I haven't mentioned a specific moment, though my answer here is a specific moment, and I do think he would genuinely remember this. Again, he has talked about this somewhat recently on the On Fire podcast, and that is the no votes tribal. And again, this is a moment where, again, Jeff loves to talk about how complex this vote was, and that he had to go to the reunion show and explain it to the audience, to where, again, I think this is something he very much remembers. It's something that he does talk about as one of the more complex vote-offs in the history of the show, to where he also likes to bring it up as this example of how these very niche tiebreaker situations play out. So again, it's still something he talks about in a pretty definitive answer here. Next up for co-wrong, and co-wrong actually is a little bit difficult here. I don't feel like there is a super solid answer in my mind, where if we're going at the time, I could see a world where it's the Caleb medevac, where obviously this is a season that was very much hyped up as having so many medevacs, to where I could see a world where, and his answer is the Caleb medevac. Yeah, again, I don't really feel like there's like definitive proof of that, to where, again, here I decided to go again with a very loose story. However, the debate was which story is that, as I think there could be a debate on which of the two it is. Yeah, I ended up going with the story of Aubrey. I think he remembers Aubrey having a breakdown in the first round of the game, only to then recover and go on to play a very impressive game. And I feel like that is something that he remembers. He remembers like Aubrey's growth over the course of this season, where I think it's something he would mention. I mean, the other person I considered was Ty, where I think there's a world where he very much remembers Ty's role in this season. And again, obviously Ty not giving his idol to Scott Pollard, and again, a lot of these other moments. And to be fair, I think there's also a world where he just mentions the concept of the super idol. But though, again, I do think the thing that he remembered the most is probably Aubrey's run this season, though again, it's very much up for grabs. Next up for Survivor, Millennials versus Gen X. And this is another one where there is so much to potentially talk about here. Again, I think you got Jay's fake idol play and Jay getting taken out after that. I think that's something he would mention. Obviously, you can mention the rock draw, which I think would be very high on this list as well. Yeah, again, I do think this would be another situation where it's essentially between two stories on this season. Or the one I end up going with here is David's story. I think he very much remembers David Wright's story of him starting off the game on the outs and being this very paranoid player and talking about these insecurities he has even in his real life, and then proceeds to play an extremely impressive game and go on to say by the end that he realized that him being scared of death led to him being scared of life. And again, his development through that, again, I think is a thing that Jeff would mention. I think that is an arc that was really impactful for Jeff at the time. Now, again, I could also see a world where it's Adam's arc. I think that would be the other one, where obviously Adam winning the game while having to struggle with knowing that his mom is terminally ill and obviously her later passing, but immediately after he got home. Though the reason I didn't go with this one here is, one, again, I feel like he talked about David's arc a bit more, but also considering he's not particularly high on Adam nowadays, I feel like it was just easier to go the other way here. Next up for Survivor Game Changers, and this one has two very solid answers, both of them surrounding Suri. For the one I didn't go with here is Advantage Geddon, which I will say, I think it would be very close to being the answer here, where Advantage Geddon is a moment that, while, again, obviously most of the superfan community did not like it, it's a moment that Jeff does love, which he shouldn't, but again, he does. But again, the answer I am going with here, again, a pretty definitive answer in my mind, and that is Suri crossing the balance beam, which again, I don't care, but Jeff does. Jeff talks about this as like one of the best moments, and to be fair, I think this is also a moment that is very integral to Survivor history. I think it is because of this moment that Jeff really started to lean into moments like this and tries to make more of these motivational moments and try to focus on the journeys that the players are having at the time of being on the island, where you're really focusing on the players' experiences and journeys through the season, which is very much playing into Jeff's current mindset on the show, where again, I think this is a very integral moment. I think Jeff would even tell you that this is a very integral moment to how he viewed the show, to where, and I think that is the answer here for Game Changers. Next up for HHH, and obviously, again, most of the answers here revolve around Ben. Again, Jeff loves Ben. Put Ben in his Mount Rushmore during the preseason of Survivor 40, to where, again, Ben is probably an answer. It's a matter of which Ben moment. Is it him dropping Ben bombs? Is it just the concept of him having this massive run of finding idols? Or is it the moment that I picked here, and that's him winning the fire making challenge? Now, in general, I could see a world where like the answer is simply just Ben's story, as again, I think there's definitely a chance of that, of him talking about how Ben was this king that was taken down only for him to play idols and then thought he was dead until he was given a second chance by the fire making challenge and won the game. Again, I could definitely see him going through the spiel about Ben's story. I decided to go for a specific moment and mentioning the forced fire making twists in particular. Obviously, this is the first season with the forced fire making twist, something that Jeff still loves to this day. But again, I think he would at least try to incorporate that into the answer. So again, I did go with specifically Ben winning the Final Four fire making challenge as the answer here. Next up for Ghost Island, and again, there's a pretty definitive answer here. I do feel like while you can mention Jonathan getting the buoy as, again, another one of these like Suri style moments, and it's still definitely a moment that he does love, I feel like it's not anywhere close to the legacy that my actual answer has. It is obviously the first ever tie at Final Tribal Council. So again, having a tie in the final vote is something that is still very surreal that happened. I feel like Jeff himself would very much hype this up as the best moment of the season, and having these two formidable foes of Wendell and Dominic next to each other to where we got this time. He would also use this as an excuse of why forced fire making works, even though this happens probably without forced fire making anyway. But still, again, I do feel like this is such a big moment in Survivor history for him that I think this is definitely the answer. Next up for David vs. Goliath, and I actually think David vs. Goliath is a very difficult one. While obviously David vs. Goliath is a great season, even he recognized that, I feel like it actually is a tough one to distinguish what is the best moment. For a while, there's a lot of Angelina stuff, and he was very high on Angelina at the time. He said that Angelina was the person he wanted to see back the most from this season, and I very much considered picking Angelina's rice negotiation as an answer in particular, as obviously the rice negotiation plays a factor into the current rice negotiation we have. The one I end up going with here is, again, one that is more so mentioned more in the modern day, and one that we hear him talk about on the On Fire podcast, and that is Christian winning immunity against Alec. This David beating the Goliath. But again, I think Jeff very much likes to talk up Christian for this moment. Again, Christian having this big underdog win against Alec in this big immunity challenge, to where it is, again, it's still a moment that he does mention to this day, to where, while I think at the time it definitely might have been something Angelina focused, I think seeing what he talks about nowadays, I feel like this would be the answer instead. Next for Edge of Extinction, and really I feel like there's multiple answers here. I mean, obviously something that he did love from the season was Rick Devens. I mean, Rick Devens is one of his favorite players ever, and I think you definitely mentioned the run of Rick Devens on this season. Also, I mean, obviously he was very happy with Edge of Extinction, and he very much loved how the twist played out, to where I think you could also mention Reem on Edge of Extinction as something that he would talk about. Obviously, Reem having been the first one out and actually stuck it out the entire time, and I think that is something he would consider as well, though the answer I end up going with here is obviously the main thing this season's remembered for, and that is obviously Chris Underwood coming back at the end of the season and proceeding to win. And again, I think that'll be the moment that he would mention here. He would try to really hype up Edge of Extinction as a twist. So while he recognized that casual audience doesn't like it that much, he still clearly loves it himself, and I do feel like Chris coming back from the edge and winning the game really justified the twist in his mind. Where obviously you could specifically mention Chris giving up immunity and taking on Rick and Fire, which again, if we're going for a specific individual moment, I feel like that would be the moment he mentions, though again, I think he's more likely to just mention Chris coming back from the edge and making these big moves to win the game as a more general storyline that encapsulate everything here, though it really could go either way there. Next up for IOI, and straight up I just think he just tries to forget this season happened. I feel like he doesn't really want to remember a specific moment from this season. So because of that, I'm going to go with Robin Sandra coming back, I guess. Now, I mean, if you want to be really technical, I could see a world where he does say something Elaine focused. Again, we know he very much loved Elaine at the time, and I could see him answering something like that. I could also see him bringing up like the idol hunt and the finale, which I know he was like proud of how they put the clue on the buff, but again, I think the main notable thing from this season for him is obviously just them getting Rob and Sandra to come back to mentor these new players. So again, I think that's the answer I'm going to go with here. Next up for Winners at War, and obviously, and Jeff loves Winners at War. I mean, I think there's like a number of things you can mention here. So obviously, again, you can mention Tony and his run on this season, though again, don't know if that's actually the answer. You can mention the introduction of fire tokens, which, to be fair, at the time, I think he might have answered, though. Considering how fire tokens obviously just disappeared after this, I don't think he would answer that anymore. Also, you can mention, again, a lot of Edge-related things. You can mention Ethan on the Edge, which I think is something that he would definitely consider mentioning. You could also mention just the farewell to the OG players. And just in general, I think you'd also see him mention just the general concept that this was a celebration of the show and potentially talk about the family visit. Though the answer I ended up going with here is something that, again, I think you really love at the time. Is again, this was another moment of it really just justifying the Edge of Extinction, and that is Natalie's story on the season. So again, I know he came out of the season being very high on Natalie, and again, a lot of that comes from the fact that I think she justified the Edge of Extinction. I think she played the Edge of Extinction game in the way that Jeff wanted someone to. Someone that would find all these advantages and get all these fire tokens as they come back into the game. Again, it really feels like Natalie's arc on this season really encapsulates like everything he loved about Winners at War into one. Well, again, I don't know how much that has aged over time, particularly again due to the lack of fire tokens nowadays. I do still feel like at the end of the day, this is probably the answer that has the most proof to it, so again, I decided to go with that here. And now we're on to the new era. 41 in particular, I think it's a little bit tough. I feel like there's not really a definitive answer because I feel like there's a lot of moments that he does kind of like. Again, he loved the hourglass twist at the time, though considering the negative reaction to it, I feel like that's not the answer here. I think he also would mention do or die, though that's another one. He knows the fan reception to it, so I don't think he would answer it. I think he could potentially mention the fire making challenge from this season that they were really hyped up as one of the closest ever, to where that could potentially be it. And also Evie memorizing the puzzle, which he was so impressed by, could be something that Jeff would mention here. Also Shan and her run on the season, her eventual blindside is something he can mention. Though the answer I'm going to go with here is, again, something he does talk about quite a bit nowadays, even though it's more so related to the concept more so than the specific moment, but I'm going to go with the knowledge is power play. Where obviously the move from Xander to pass off the idol and nullify the knowledge is power is obviously this big moment for this season where, again, I could see him bringing up that, though I really think just in general, the concept of the knowledge is power is probably the thing that he loves even more. Where, again, it becomes very clear through Jeff's recent podcast that, again, he loves the knowledge is power. Not because he actually loves it being in the game, but more so he loves what it means for how people play the game to counter the knowledge is power. To where as much as, like, again, he has heard that people think knowledge is power is overpowered, he still seems to defend the twist as it led to more like idols passing around and a lot of people playing paranoid, where, again, I think that is what Jeff liked. To where, again, I think I would go something knowledge is power related here, as I think that's something that he came off of this season being very proud of. Next up for 42, and 42 is probably the most difficult new era season to make an answer of here, as I think it's probably the season that we've heard the least about Jeff's specific opinions of the season, though, again, there's things we do know he likes. He loves Drea, he loves Marianne. I could see him mentioning the Drea-Marianne moment. At the Split Tribal, I could also see him mentioning just Marianne winning as the answer, but also we know he loved Jonathan at the time, and I can see a world where him being called Mr. Jeff is potentially an answer, though the answer I'm going to go with here is, again, just Jonathan beasting out that immunity challenge in episode 3, where I know that's something he was like hyping up at the time, and still talks about Jonathan's challenge prowess at points, to where, considering this is like the definitive moment of Jonathan's challenge prowess, I feel like that would be the moment I would pick here. Next up for Survivor 43, and this one is pretty obvious. While I think there is another potential answer in Noelle winning the reward challenge after having a massive comeback, I think that's definitely one that would be very much a consideration. I feel like the answer I'm going to go with here is the biggest moment of the season, that is the Cody blindside. Now, again, I think there's also a world where he does mention, again, all the idols passing around and Jesse having gotten 2 idols due to that, but I think Jesse betraying Cody is definitely something that he would talk about, especially at the time. I feel like that was pretty much the big thing to come from this season for him. Again, we know that he was not happy with how the season played out and was very much looking at Jesse, Cody, and Carla as the season's big players, to where, considering this is like the big move made in the end game here, I feel like that is the answer I'm going to go with here. Next up for Survivor 44, and this one has a very easy answer. And while there are actual moments to mention here from the likes of Carolyn getting her idol from the birdcage, which again he has talked about as being one of his favorite moments. We also have, again, Carson memorizing puzzles. We have Heidi winning fire making in record breaking time, which I know he would mention. Jam Jam winning is something he would mention, considering he loves Jam Jam. But the definitive answer here is, again, not an actual moment, but the overall storyline of the season, that being the story of the Tika 3. I think he loves this idea that these 3 players that you would never guess would be able to run a season of Survivor, end up doing so. And that is the thing that, again, at the time, we heard preseason about how much production loved 44. And I think post 44 became a question mark of like, why is that the case? For a while, again, most people liked 44. I do think there was still this question mark. Why were they hyping up this much? And I think it's clear after the show, the reason they were hyping up this much is because of how much they loved the Tika 3 and how much they loved their story and thought their story was riveting at the time. Which, again, I'm sure it was at the time of filming where you didn't know what the result was going to be, but because the edit of the show was so obvious that Tika 3 were going to run the show, that it made it a bit less interesting to me. But again, I do think the story of the Tika 3 here would be the answer. Next up for 45, and again, 45, I think there's also a pretty definitive answer, though I think there definitely are some pretty big considerations. I mean, again, Katurah and her moment at the challenge is something to mention here, of that being, again, another one of these like Sari or Jonathan moments, though I did not pick that one. I did not pick Kelly's blindside, even though I was very, very close to doing so. Again, I think if we're actually, again, going to one specific moment in the season, I think it would be the Kelly blindside. I think that's something that, again, he talked about as being this big move for the season, and again, even went on to repost Dalton Ross's article talking about that episode being the best episode in the new era. Where, again, I do think he looks at that Blindside very highly. But again, I did not pick it. Also did not pick bringing back the Survivor auction, where while I think he was very happy with that, I would not answer that here. The answer I did end up going with here is, again, not an actual moment, but an overall storyline. That is the story of Emily. And again, he talked about this at the time of 45, that Emily is one of his favorite players of all time, to where he constantly talked about her growth arc over the season. And in general, again, I think this is the answer here. I feel like this is the thing that he came out of 45 feeling the most positive on, where while there's definitely a world where, again, that's changed over time, and maybe he would answer to Kelly Blindside now. I feel like at least at the time, I feel more confident in him picking Emily's storyline on the season. But with that, we're now on to 46. And with 46, I mean, this is probably the most loose answer of them all, where while I do think there are actual moments on this season that he could potentially mention. Again, you got Liz's meltdown over Applebee's. You have Jelinski saying several means 7. You have Banu's overall story on the season. You have the Bermuda Triangle Challenge, where you had this fun banter that Jeff really loved. You have the moment of Q quitting the game and all the craziness at the live tribal there. You have, the Charlie Maria dynamic, which I'm sure he would talk a lot about postseason. You also have the fact that the players got no rice, which is something he really likes to hype up, to pretend like the new era is the most difficult thing to ever exist. Though I think the answer here, again, is the loosest answer you could possibly create, but this is a thing he would constantly talk about during this season. He constantly talked about how this season would be remembered for this, and that is vicious gameplay / blindside / I think you can also translate this to people getting blindsided with idols in their pockets. But again, I think that is the thing he talks about this season, talking about how this was one of the most strategic seasons of the show, and that the level of gameplay on this season was extremely high, with players playing viciously, which, again, I don't know if I would really agree with that. But again, that's the take that Jeff seemed to have after filming of the season, where, again, that's something he would constantly mention in the preseason of the season, is how vicious the gameplay is. So, while, again, I think you could probably mention things like the Liz meltdown, which, again, he was also very high on. I still think, again, the thing he would constantly talk about this season is, again, the vicious gameplay, and how so many people are blindsided in the game, and blindsided with idols in their pockets all in a row, where, again, I think that is the standout thing for him. So, again, that is the answer here. With that, again, that is what I think Jeff Probst's favorite moment from every season of Survivor is. Now, moving forward, again, I still have more Jeff Probst video ideas planned, so stay tuned for those down the road, along with just the typical style of content for the channel. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.